the webinar is very different because the webinar is interactive. While you do have to create a storyboard, what's so good about doing a webinar is you're not alone. One of the things that if not for Andy, I would have done a webinar, but it would have been a useless webinar. It would have been one in which myself and somebody else on my team did all the presentation, but if you're the end user listening to the webinar, or the attendee, you got to think to yourself, yeah, I'm not sure if I believe these guys because there's no other speaker, nobody else validating anything.
Yep.
So I would have done it the wrong way. So the right way was that we created a webinar. This one in particular happened to be it was titled The 12 Steps of Recruiting A Players. And we got 3 speakers that, well-known speakers. One was a senior VP of a well-known company, and the other 2 one was a VP of talent acquisition for a company, and the third was an HR VP.
Yep.
The problem is that the speaker that we preferred the most, the top person, dropped off the day of the webinar.
But the strategy you use,
for
those of you who don't understand this, I mean, we'll have to move forward on this because of time, but what Charles did is we have a strategy whereby you attract, or you bring on board mavens. Mavens are industry leaders in your niche, and you get these guys to really endorse subtly, indirectly endorse you and your branding. So you get that positioning by alignment. And what Charles did is he identified 3 top A players in his industry, brought them to his webinar. Unfortunately, one of them dropped out on the day of the webinar, so that obviously had a slight impact on the webinar. But as Charles and I were discussing before this call, there are ways that you can ensure that doesn't happen, and that comes from creating a win-win-win for all those attending with the webinar, both either the Maven, Charles's company, but also the attendee. So that's something Charles can improve on next time. The actual making sure the right people move up. But in terms of the webinar itself, Charles, just give us a very brief overview. How long did the webinar last? Who did you have on the webinar, and what results did you get from it?
Okay, we ended up with having over 100. Our max, because of our GoToWebinar, is 100, and we didn't want to do any more than that, to be honest with you, the first time out.
Yep.
So while we had more than 100 that registered for attendance, we had 64 that actually attended.
Yep.
I'm not sure if that is a good number, but we were happy that we had, for a first time out, that number, okay, that attended. I mean, we thought, first timer, that's not bad.
That's awesome. Yep.
The way we set the webinar was really important. We originally thought that the webinar would last for an entire. We tried to shoot for 30 minutes or under. It didn't. It turned out to be actually 43 minutes. Now, after going through webinars with Andy and attending other webinars, I've come to the conclusion that no matter if you try to schedule a webinar for 30 minutes or an hour, it will always go over. Okay.
True.
It's just the way it is. All right. So don't let that worry you, because that's just the nature of the beast. So we were smart about the webinar because we started off with introducing the speakers, who they were going to be. Then we broke it off into the sections. So as we were presenting the content, the slides on the webinar, it wasn't just being presented by myself or one of my business partners. It was part of that was being presented by the speakers themselves. We thought that was really important, so that the attendees didn't think it was, so it was more believable.
Yep.
Okay, what we're saying, so it was more believable. And the fact that these speakers we had successfully recruited for them. So they were proof positive. At the end of the webinar, so the webinar itself lasted about 22 minutes, and the rest of it, after the 22 minutes, took up to 43, was a Q&A. So, and the Q&A is extremely important because that's where the real engagement comes in.
Hmm.
The real engagement comes in because when people ask questions, you're writing notes, and your notes that you're writing. This is what's so interesting about the Q&A in a webinar. You can get a sense of what information to send that person who asked that question. So we quickly, as soon as the webinar was over, I quickly got on the phone with my business partners, and we realized, wow, wait a second, Joe here, we want to call him, but Jill, we want to send her this information based upon her questions. So we quickly realized that we didn't want to send a prepackaged thank you for attending the webinar excuse me, email, right, that was the same for everybody. But like I said, we quickly learned that, boy, the great thing about the Q&A is we hear the concerns of some of the people asking the questions. We see the chat feedback. Some of them are in the chat window. So we actually delivered 5 different pieces of content after the webinar, including follow-up calls.
Awesome. And you picked up a search from that webinar, that first one, didn't you, Charles?
Yes, we picked up a search from that.
And what was that search worth to you?
It was 54K actually.
54K. So let's just recap the results Charles has gone through here. What Charles has done